Sometimes the most ordinary moments can turn into life-changing events in the blink of an eye. What started as a simple evening walk through a quiet neighborhood would soon become a story of courage, terror, and unexpected heroism. Three men thought they had found an easy target. They saw a young woman walking alone, earbuds in, completely unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. What they didn't know was that her evening companion, walking just 50 yards behind, was someone they definitely didn't want to encounter. Marcus Thompson had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, countless high-risk missions, and situations that would break most people. But nothing had prepared him for what he was about to witness on this peaceful Tuesday evening in suburban Denver. The skills that had kept him alive in some of the world's most dangerous places were about to be put to the test on American soil, protecting a complete stranger whose life hung in the balance. This is the story of how 3 predators picked the wrong victim in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's about split-second decisions, the thin line between victim and survivor, and what happens when evil meets someone trained to fight back. Most importantly, it's about how one man's oath to protect and serve didn't end when he left the military, and how sometimes the most unlikely heroes appear exactly when they're needed most. Sarah Mitchell had always been careful about her evening walks, but after 6 months in her new neighborhood without incident, she had grown comfortable with her routine. The tree-lined streets of Riverside Park seemed like the safest place in Denver, filled with joggers, dog walkers, and families enjoying the crisp autumn air. At 26, Sarah worked as a pediatric nurse at Denver Children's Hospital, and these evening walks had become her way of decompressing after long shifts dealing with sick children and worried parents. Tonight felt no different from any other Tuesday evening. Sarah had finished her shift at 7, grabbed a quick dinner at home, and headed out for her usual 3-mile loop through the neighborhood. She plugged in her earbuds, selected her favorite podcast about true crime stories, and began her familiar route down Maple Street toward the park trail. The irony of listening to crime stories while walking alone would not be lost on her later. What Sarah didn't notice was the beat-up sedan that had been following her for the past 10 minutes. Inside, 3 men had been watching her routine for over a week. Derek Martinez, the driver, was a career criminal with a long history of assault and robbery. At 32, he had spent more years behind bars than out of them, and his recent release from state prison had done nothing to reform his violent tendencies. His passengers, Tommy Jenkins and Ray Sullivan, were younger but equally dangerous. They had met Derek in county jail 6 months earlier, and together they had been planning something they called easy money. The 3 men had developed a simple but effective strategy. They would identify young women who walked alone regularly, study their patterns, and strike when the opportunity presented itself. They preferred victims who seemed distracted, wore expensive items, or appeared physically unable to fight back. Sarah checked all their boxes. She was petite at 5'4", always wore the same route, carried a nice phone, and seemed completely absorbed in whatever she was listening to through her expensive wireless earbuds. Derek slowly drove past Sarah, noting her position on the quiet stretch of trail that wound through a wooded section of the park. This area was perfect for their purposes. It was far enough from the main road that screams wouldn't be heard, but close enough that they could make a quick escape. The nearest street light was broken, leaving long shadows where they could wait undetected. Most importantly, at this time of evening, this section of trail was usually deserted. Meanwhile, about 50 yards behind Sarah, Marcus Thompson was also out for his evening exercise routine. But unlike Sarah's leisurely walk, Marcus was on a training run. At 34, the former Navy SEAL maintained the same physical conditioning that had carried him through 8 years of military service, including 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan. Even though he had been discharged 6 months ago and was now working as a security consultant for a private firm, Marcus kept to a strict fitness regimen that included daily runs, weight training, and martial arts practice. Marcus had chosen to live in this neighborhood specifically because it reminded him of the peaceful small town where he grew up in Montana. After years of high-stress military operations, he craved the normalcy of suburban life. His apartment was a modest 1-bedroom place, 3 blocks from where Sarah lived, though the two had never met. Marcus preferred to run in the evenings because the cooler temperature reminded him of early morning training exercises during his military days. Unlike most runners who used music or podcasts for entertainment, Marcus ran in silence. Years of training had taught him to stay aware of his surroundings at all times. This heightened awareness was not something he could simply turn off after leaving the military. Even in this safe suburban neighborhood, Marcus automatically scanned for potential threats, noted unusual sounds, and kept track of the people around him. His instructors at SEAL training had called it situational awareness, and it had become second nature. As Marcus rounded the bend that led to the wooded section of trail, he noticed several things that immediately put him on alert. First, there was a car parked in an area where parking wasn't normally allowed, with its engine running but no driver visible. Second, he could see a young woman walking ahead of him, completely absorbed in whatever she was listening to, completely unaware that three men had emerged from the shadows and were positioning themselves to intercept her path. The three assailants had been waiting in the trees for nearly 20 minutes, growing increasingly impatient. Derek kept checking his watch and cursing under his breath. They had planned this carefully, but timing was crucial. They needed to grab Sarah, take her money and phone, and disappear before anyone else came along the trail. Derek had brought a knife, while Tommy carried a heavy flashlight that could double as a weapon. Ray was supposed to be the lookout, but he was more nervous than the others and kept fidgeting with a piece of rope they had brought in case they needed to restrain their victim. Sarah was now less than 30 yards from their position, still completely unaware of the danger ahead. Her podcast was discussing the psychology of predators, and she found herself thinking about how terrible it must be for victims who never saw an attack coming. She was so engrossed in the story that she didn't notice when the normal sounds of the evening had suddenly stopped. There were no birds chirping, no distant traffic noise, no other people around. The unnatural quiet should have been a warning sign, but Sarah's earbuds blocked out the subtle environmental cues that might have alerted her to danger. Marcus, however, had noticed the silence immediately. His training kicked in automatically, and he began to assess the situation with the same methodical approach he had used in hostile territory overseas. He could see three male figures positioned strategically around the trail ahead. Their body language and positioning indicated hostile intent. The woman walking in front of him was heading directly into what his military training would have classified as a kill zone. Marcus faced a split-second decision that would determine the outcome for everyone involved. He could turn around, call the police, and hope they arrived in time. He could shout a warning to the woman, which might scare off the attackers, but could also escalate the situation if they were armed. Or he could use his training to neutralize the threat before the woman was harmed. Years of combat experience had taught Marcus that hesitation in these situations often led to casualties. The decision was made for him when Derek stepped out onto the trail directly in front of Sarah. She looked up, startled, and tried to step around him, but Tommy emerged from the other side, blocking her path. Only then did Sarah realize she was in serious trouble. She pulled out her earbuds and looked around desperately for help, but saw only empty trails stretching in both directions. Derek smiled when he saw the fear in Sarah's eyes. This was the moment he enjoyed most about these attacks, when the victim realized they were completely helpless. He pulled out his knife and held it where Sarah could see it clearly. Tommy moved closer, cutting off any possibility of escape back the way she had come. Ray stayed in position near the trees, watching for potential witnesses. Sarah's heart pounded as she tried to remember everything she had learned in the self-defense class she had taken 2 years earlier. But facing real violence was nothing like practicing in a controlled environment. These men were larger, stronger, and clearly experienced at intimidation. The knife in Derek's hand glinted in the fading daylight, and Sarah realized that this situation could easily become much worse than simple robbery. Marcus was now close enough to hear the conversation. Though he remained hidden behind trees about 20 yards away, he could see that the woman was terrified but trying to stay calm, which showed intelligence and courage under pressure. The three men seemed confident that they had complete control of the situation, which would work in Marcus's favor. Overconfident opponents often made tactical errors that could be exploited. From his position, Marcus could see that the man with the knife appeared to be the leader, while the other two seemed to be following his directions. Standard military strategy would suggest neutralizing the leader first, but Marcus knew that civilian rescue operations required different considerations. His primary objective was protecting the innocent woman, which meant minimizing the risk of the situation escalating to violence if possible. Derek stepped closer to Sarah and spoke in a low, threatening voice that he thought sounded intimidating. He demanded her phone, wallet, and jewelry, making it clear that resistance would not be tolerated. Sarah fumbled with her purse, trying to comply while looking for any opportunity to escape or call for help. But with three men surrounding her and no one else visible on the trail, her options seemed non-existent. What none of the four people in this confrontation realized was that everything was about to change dramatically. Marcus had completed his tactical assessment and was preparing to act. Years of training in close-quarters combat, stealth operations, and hostage rescue had prepared him for exactly this type of scenario. The only difference was that this time, instead of fighting for his country on foreign soil, he was fighting to protect a fellow American citizen on home ground. The three criminals thought they had chosen the perfect victim and the perfect location for their crime. They had no idea that their perfectly planned operation was about to encounter something they had never faced before. A highly trained professional warrior who had sworn an oath to protect innocent people, and who possessed both the skills and the determination to make good on that promise, regardless of the personal cost. Marcus moved through the shadows with the silent precision that had kept him alive through countless night operations in Afghanistan. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to bring him closer to the three criminals without alerting them to his presence. His years of SEAL training had taught him that the element of surprise was often the deciding factor between mission success and catastrophic failure. Tonight, failure was not an option. Sarah's hand shook as she tried to remove her wedding ring, which had belonged to her grandmother and represented one of her most precious possessions. Derek grew impatient with her slow compliance and gestured menacingly with his knife, telling her to move faster or face the consequences. The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah realized that even if she gave them everything they wanted, there was no guarantee they would let her walk away unharmed. Tommy positioned himself where he could grab Sarah if she tried to run, while Ray continued to watch the trail approaches for potential witnesses. The three men had done this type of robbery 4 times in the past month, and each previous attack had followed the same pattern. They would threaten the victim with violence, take whatever valuables they could find, and disappear into the night before police could respond. What they hadn't expected was that tonight would be different. From his concealed position behind a large oak tree, Marcus could see that the situation was escalating. The woman's compliance was actually encouraging the criminals to become more aggressive, as they sensed her fear and vulnerability. This was a common pattern Marcus had observed in hostage situations overseas. Predators became emboldened when they perceived no threat to their control, which often led them to take greater risks and make tactical mistakes. Marcus knew he had to act quickly, but he also understood that rushing into the situation without a clear plan could result in the woman being seriously injured or killed. These criminals had already demonstrated their willingness to use weapons, and desperate people often made unpredictable choices when cornered. The key was to neutralize the immediate threat, while minimizing the risk to the innocent victim. Derek stepped even closer to Sarah, now close enough that she could smell the alcohol on his breath and see the crude tattoos covering his arms. He reached out to grab her purse, and when she instinctively pulled back, he raised the knife higher and spoke words that would later be repeated in police reports and court testimony. The threat he made was explicit, violent, and left no doubt about his intentions if Sarah continued to resist. This was the moment Marcus had been waiting for. Derek had positioned himself in a way that blocked Tommy's view of the trail behind them, while Ray was focused on watching the opposite direction. The tactical situation was as favorable as Marcus could hope for, and any further delay would only increase the risk to the woman's safety. Marcus emerged from the shadows with the fluid motion of a predator himself, but unlike the three criminals, his predatory instincts were honed for protecting the innocent rather than victimizing them. His approach was silent, swift, and devastating in its precision. Derek never saw what hit him. The first technique Marcus employed was a sleeper hold that cut off blood flow to Derek's brain without permanently damaging his windpipe. Within seconds, Derek collapsed unconsciously to the ground, his knife clattering harmlessly on the asphalt trail. Tommy spun around in shock, trying to process what had just happened to his partner, but Marcus was already moving toward the second target. Tommy swung his heavy flashlight at Marcus's head, a blow that would have seriously injured or killed most people. But Marcus had been trained to fight multiple armed opponents simultaneously, and he deflected the attack while simultaneously striking Tommy's solar plexus with a precise blow that doubled him over in agony. Before Tommy could recover, Marcus applied a joint lock that sent the flashlight flying and left Tommy writhing on the ground with a dislocated shoulder. Ray realized that their easy robbery had turned into a nightmare, and he made the mistake of trying to run rather than fight. But Marcus had anticipated this response, and years of pursuing fleeing enemies through hostile territory had taught him exactly how to handle someone attempting to escape. Ray made it less than 20 yards before Marcus brought him down with a tackle that would have made his high school football coach proud. The entire confrontation lasted less than 90 seconds. Justice fear. 3 armed criminals who had seemed completely in control of the situation were now lying on the ground, neutralized by a single opponent who had appeared as if from nowhere. Sarah stood frozen in shock, trying to process what had just happened, and whether her mysterious rescuer represented salvation or a new threat. Marcus quickly assessed the 3 criminals to ensure they posed no immediate danger, then turned his attention to Sarah. His voice was calm and reassuring as he identified himself and explained that she was now safe. But he could see that she was in shock, and his military medical training told him that she needed immediate attention to prevent delayed psychological trauma. Sarah's first coherent words were to ask Marcus who he was and whether the three men were dead. Marcus explained that he was a military veteran who had been running on the trail and that all three attackers were alive but incapacitated. He had already pulled out his cell phone to call 911, and he guided Sarah to a nearby bench where she could sit down while they waited for police and paramedics to arrive. Derek was the first of the three criminals to regain consciousness, and his reaction was a mixture of confusion, rage, and fear. He had never encountered anyone who could neutralize him so quickly and efficiently, and he realized that he was facing someone with professional combat training. His attempts to intimidate Marcus with threats and curses only resulted in Marcus restraining him more securely, while maintaining the same calm demeanor he had shown throughout the encounter. Tommy's dislocated shoulder caused him considerable pain, but Marcus's medical training allowed him to provide temporary stabilization until paramedics could arrive. Despite the fact that Tommy had tried to assault him with a potentially lethal weapon, Marcus treated his injury with the same professional competence he had shown when providing medical aid to wounded soldiers overseas. Ray suffered the least physical damage, but his psychological state was arguably the worst of the three. He kept asking Marcus how he had moved so quickly and quietly, and whether he was some kind of special forces soldier. Ray's questions revealed that he had never encountered real violence before tonight, and that he had been drawn into crime by Derek's promises of easy money, without considering the potential consequences. As they waited for emergency responders to arrive, Marcus learned more about Sarah's background and why she had been targeted. She explained her nursing career, her evening walking routine, and her growing realization that someone had been watching her for several days before the attack. This information confirmed Marcus's assessment that the three criminals were experienced predators who had carefully planned their attack rather than acting on impulse. Sarah's shock began to wear off as she realized the full scope of what had almost happened to her and what Marcus had prevented. Her gratitude was obvious, but Marcus deflected her thanks with the same humility he had shown when receiving commendations for his military service. For him, protecting innocent people was not heroic, but simply the right thing to do. The first police officers to arrive on the scene were initially confused by what they found. 3 suspects were restrained and injured. 1 victim was unharmed but shaken, and 1 witness claimed to be responsible for single-handedly neutralizing all 3 attackers. It wasn't until Marcus showed his military identification and explained his background that the officers began to understand how the situation had unfolded. Detective Maria Rodriguez was the first investigator to arrive, and her 20-year career in law enforcement had exposed her to every type of violent crime imaginable. But she had never seen a case where an attempted armed robbery had been stopped so completely by a single bystander. Her initial interview with Marcus revealed the tactical sophistication of his response and the restraint he had shown in using only the minimum force necessary to protect Sarah. Derek's arrest record showed a pattern of escalating violence that suggested tonight's attack might have ended much differently if Marcus had not intervened. Previous victims had suffered serious injuries, and 1 young woman had been hospitalized for weeks after Derek's last arrest. Detective Rodriguez realized that Marcus's intervention had likely prevented not only a robbery, but potentially a sexual assault, or even murder. The paramedics who treated Tommy's shoulder were impressed by the precision of Marcus's technique. The injury was serious enough to incapacitate Tommy, but caused no permanent damage, demonstrating exactly the kind of controlled force that professional military personnel were trained to apply. This level of precision was virtually impossible for civilians to achieve without extensive specialized training. Sarah's statement to police revealed the psychological terror she had experienced during the attack, but also her amazement at how quickly the situation had reversed. She described Marcus as appearing like a guardian angel, moving with speed and confidence that seemed almost supernatural to someone who had never witnessed professional combat skills in action. As the 3 criminals were loaded into ambulances and police cars, Derek made one final attempt to intimidate Marcus, threatening revenge when he was eventually released from prison. Marcus's response was quiet but unmistakable in its sincerity. He promised Derek that if he ever threatened another innocent person, Marcus would be there to stop him again, and next time he might not be as gentle. The crime scene was processed with the thoroughness that Detective Rodriguez brought to all her cases, but the physical evidence only confirmed what witness statements had already established. 3 armed criminals had attempted to rob and potentially assault an innocent woman, and their attack had been stopped by a highly trained military veteran who had used exactly the amount of force necessary to protect the victim while minimizing harm to the perpetrators. Word of the incident began to spread through the neighborhood even before the police cars had left the scene. Residents who had felt increasingly unsafe due to recent crime increases suddenly realized that they had a protector living among them. Someone with both the skills and the character to stand up for innocent people when they were threatened by evil. The local news media picked up the story within hours of the incident, and by the next morning, Marcus Thompson found himself at the center of a media storm he had never wanted or expected. The headline in the Denver Post read, "Navy SEAL stops armed robbery in Riverside Park," accompanied by a photo of the crime scene and interviews with witnesses who had arrived after the confrontation ended. Marcus declined all interview requests, but his preference for privacy only seemed to increase public interest in his story. Sarah Mitchell, meanwhile, struggled to process the psychological impact of what she had experienced. Despite her medical training and experience dealing with trauma patients, she found herself unable to shake the memory of Derek's knife and the realization of how close she had come to serious injury or death. The Employee Assistance Program at Denver Children's Hospital provided counseling services, but Sarah discovered that recovering from a violent crime was more complex than she had ever imagined. Detective Rodriguez's investigation revealed that Derek Martinez and his accomplices had been responsible for a series of similar attacks throughout the Denver area over the past 6 months. Their method was always the same: identify vulnerable victims, study their routines, and strike when they were most isolated. The three men had stolen thousands of dollars worth of property and terrorized dozens of innocent people before finally encountering someone capable of stopping them. The legal proceedings that followed the arrests provided a fascinating glimpse into how the criminal justice system handles cases involving civilian intervention in violent crimes. Derek was charged with armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including the knife found at the scene, witness testimony from Sarah, and his own admissions to police during booking. Tommy Jenkins faced similar charges, though his lack of a weapon resulted in slightly reduced penalties. His dislocated shoulder required surgery and months of physical therapy, during which he had ample time to reconsider his life choices. The medical bills from his treatment exceeded anything he had stolen during his brief criminal career, providing a harsh lesson in the economics of crime versus punishment. Ray Sullivan, the youngest of the three, emerged from the experience most psychologically damaged. His public defender argued that he had been manipulated by Derek into participating in crimes he never would have attempted on his own. Ray's cooperation with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence provided crucial evidence about the planning and execution of multiple robberies, helping police close several unsolved cases. Marcus found his life fundamentally changed by the attention his actions had generated. His employer, impressed by the positive publicity and Marcus's demonstrated character under pressure, offered him a promotion to head of security for their largest client. Local law enforcement agencies began consulting with him on tactical training for officers, drawing on his military experience to improve their response to violent crimes. The neighborhood where the attack had occurred experienced a remarkable transformation in the months following the incident. Crime rates dropped significantly as word spread about Marcus's intervention, and residents began organizing community watch groups and self-defense classes. Property values increased as families felt safer moving into an area where neighbors looked out for each other. Sarah's recovery was gradual but steady, aided by the knowledge that her attackers were facing serious prison sentences and would not be threatening other innocent people for many years. She returned to her evening walks, though now she carried pepper spray and remained more aware of her surroundings. Most importantly, she had learned that evil exists in the world, but so do people willing to stand up against it. The trial proceedings attracted national attention as legal experts debated the boundaries of civilian intervention in violent crimes. Marcus's military training had enabled him to neutralize 3 armed criminals without killing anyone, demonstrating a level of restraint that few civilians could match. His actions raised important questions about the responsibilities of trained individuals to protect innocent people from criminal violence. Derek Martinez's sentencing hearing provided a forum for his victims to confront him directly. Sarah was one of 7 women who testified about the terror and trauma they had experienced during robberies committed by Derek and his associates. The judge noted that Marcus's intervention had likely prevented additional victims from suffering similar or worse treatment. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that Derek exhibited classic patterns of antisocial personality disorder, with no genuine remorse for his victims and a high likelihood of reoffending if released. The prosecutor's recommendation of a 25-year sentence reflected both the severity of his crimes and the danger he posed to public safety. Tommy's case followed a different trajectory. as his cooperation with authorities and apparent genuine remorse resulted in a more lenient sentence. His testimony revealed the extent to which Derek had manipulated both him and Ray into participating in increasingly violent crimes. Tommy's story illustrated how criminal enterprises often recruit young people through promises of easy money while concealing the true risks and consequences. Ray's sentencing hearing was the most emotionally charged, as his family members testified about his transformation from a promising student into a criminal accomplice. His mother's tears as she described watching her son's arrest on television provided a stark reminder that crime creates victims far beyond its immediate targets. Marcus attended all 3 sentencing hearings, not out of vindictiveness, but from a sense of responsibility to see the legal process through to completion. His presence served as a reminder to the defendants and the court that their crimes had been witnessed by someone capable of stopping them, and that similar consequences awaited anyone who threatened innocent people. The broader impact of Marcus's actions extended far beyond the immediate criminal case. Military veterans organizations used his story to illustrate how the values and training acquired in service to the country could benefit civilian communities. Self-defense instructors incorporated tactical elements from Marcus's response into their curricula, though they emphasized that his level of skill required years of professional training. Local police departments began recruiting veterans more actively, recognizing that their combat experience and tactical training provided valuable skills for law enforcement. The incident also sparked discussions about improving cooperation between military veterans and civilian first responders, creating better networks for community protection. Sarah's nursing career took on new meaning as she began volunteering with victim advocacy groups, using her medical training to help other crime victims navigate the physical and psychological aftermath of violent encounters. Her experience had taught her that recovery from trauma required both professional treatment and community support. The friendship that developed between Sarah and Marcus illustrated how shared adversity could create lasting bonds between strangers. Though they came from different backgrounds and had never met before the night of the attack, their experience had created a connection based on mutual respect and understanding. Marcus's decision to remain in the neighborhood rather than seeking anonymity elsewhere demonstrated his commitment to community protection. His presence served as a deterrent to potential criminals, while reassuring law-abiding residents that someone was watching out for their safety. Property managers began advertising the area as having enhanced security due to his residence. The incident also sparked broader discussions about personal safety and community responsibility. Self-defense classes saw increased enrollment as residents realized that they could not always depend on police to arrive in time to prevent crimes. Community organizations began organizing safety workshops and neighborhood watch programs. Marcus's story resonated particularly strongly with other military veterans who were struggling to find purpose in civilian life. His example showed that the skills and values developed in military service could be channeled into positive civilian roles, protecting communities and serving others in peacetime just as they had during wartime. The media tension eventually subsided, but the impact of that Tuesday evening in Riverside Park continued to ripple through the community for years afterward. Crime statistics showed sustained reductions in violent offenses, community engagement increased, and residents reported feeling safer in their own neighborhood. Derek Martinez was ultimately sentenced to 30 years in prison without possibility of parole for 25 years. Tommy received 15 years with parole eligibility after 10. Ray was sentenced to 5 years with the possibility of early release for good behavior and continued cooperation with law enforcement. Marcus Thompson returned to his quiet life as a security consultant, but he never again walked the neighborhood trails without remembering that Tuesday evening when evil had encountered someone trained and willing to stop it. His actions had proven that sometimes the most ordinary moments can become opportunities for extraordinary heroism, and that the oath to protect and defend doesn't end when the uniform comes off. The story of what happened that night became part of local legend, passed down through families and shared with newcomers as an example of what their community represented. It was a reminder that in a world where violence and cruelty seem increasingly common, there are still people willing to risk themselves to protect strangers, and that sometimes the difference between tragedy and triumph comes down to being in the right place at the right time with the courage to act.